David Kipping is an astronomy professor at Columbia. He is also an evolutionist, which means he has taken on an enormous burden of proof. Here's what he says in a new video.
Published in Nature this summer, they claim to be able to date the age of what is known as Luca, the lowest universal common ancestor. All life on Earth shares a common ancestor, evidenced by our universal genetic codes.
Okay, it is not lowest universal common ancestor, it is last universal common ancestor, and it is evidenced by our universal genetic code, not codes. This is the universal genetic code, so why is the universal genetic code such noteworthy evidence of common ancestry? Kipping does not explain why, but he does give a citation, this paper here out of Philip Donahue's lab. In that paper it says, the common ancestry of all extant cellular life is evidenced by the universal genetic code. Let's bring that sentence out here just to make sure we're clear on it. Quote, the common ancestry of all extant cellular life is evidenced by the universal genetic code. Now, why is that? Here is another paper, 2016, lead author David Baum, that makes a similar claim. It says that the evidence Charles Darwin had was only strengthened with the addition of molecular information in the late 20th century, and especially, what? The discovery of the universal genetic code. Again, why is that? How would that argument go exactly? Well, let's take a look here. How about if life evolved, then the genetic code would be universal. The genetic code is universal, therefore life evolved. Well, that doesn't work. That's a logical fallacy affirming the consequent. How about if we changed it to if life evolved, then the genetic code might be universal? Well, if that's true, then the genetic code might not be universal, so that's not going to work. How about if we make it probabilistic? If life evolved, then the genetic code probably is universal. Well, no, we really can't go there because how many times have we seen life evolve? We can't make a statistical argument like that. So to summarize so far, we see some problems with this argument. But it gets worse because evolution does not require a universal code. In fact, evolution would have no problem with multiple codes. How do I know this? Because there are multiple codes in nature. Here's a paper talking about some of the other codes. This highlights the remarkable number of independent genetic code changes. Now this paper, nor no one else, is saying, oh, wait a minute, evolution must be false. There's multiple codes. So obviously, the theory of evolution does not require a universal genetic code. Now granted, these other codes are minor variants on the universal genetic code. They're not completely different codes. But if you can have minor variants on the code, then you can have minor variants on those variants, and so forth and so on. You can see how if it was discovered that there was a significantly different genetic code in a species, evolutionists could handle that. In fact, I know that because there are many other significant differences found between the species, such as embryonic development pathways, radically different embryonic development pathways between otherwise similar species that evolutionists have no problem with. So it would be hard for evolutionists to maintain that if a different genetic code was found, they wouldn't be able to handle it. So to summarize, we've found that there are some problems with this argument, but also the initial premise that if evolution is true, the code would be universal, the genetic code would be universal, seems to be a little iffy in and of itself. So far we're not getting off to a very good start. So why is the genetic code such powerful evidence? There must be some other reason. What's going on here? Well, there is another reason, and Kipping did not spell it out, but other evolutionists do. There are arguments that in fact are very powerful. What are they? The first one is that there's no reason for this particular code. The code seems to be arbitrary. The second claim is that there is no reason the code should be conserved. That is, there's no reason the code should be universal. Let me show you some examples here. For the first one, here's a book by Alan Rogers. Different species could have different genetic codes, just as easily as different human populations speak different languages. But they don't. Every living thing, from the smallest microorganism to the largest whale, makes protein using essentially the same arbitrary code. What sense does that make? Unless all of these forms of life evolved from a single ancestor, 2009. Here's Mark Ridley's textbook, The code is then what Crick called a frozen accident. The original choice of a code was an accident. See, arbitrary accident. But once it had evolved, it would be strongly maintained. Now, let me give you some examples for the second claim that there is no reason the code should be conserved. Back to this Alan Rogers quote, different species could have different genetic codes. You see, there's no reason why the code should be universal. What sense does that make? And back to Ridley, but it would not be if the species had independent origins. The code would not be universal if the species had independent origins. There's no reason for the code to be universal. So we're seeing these two arguments, or these two premises. There's no reason for this particular code, and there's no reason the code, any code, should be conserved. Now let's step back for a minute. Why are these evidences for evolution? Because these evidences have no relevance to evolution. In other words, these evidences do not make evolution more likely. Remember, let's go back and look at them. There's no reason for this code. There's no reason the code should be conserved. Why are these evidences for evolution? These evidences refute creationism, and this is because of the principle of sufficient reason. God does not do anything without sufficient reason. This is a centuries-old religious doctrine. There's no reason for this code. There's no reason the code should be conserved. See that reason? There's no sufficient reason. God doesn't do anything without sufficient reason. God would not create the code we observed for those reasons, for those premises. It violates the principle of sufficient reason for God to have created this code. This is a very powerful argument. Back to Ridley, homologous similarities between species provide the most widespread class of evidence, and I would add the most powerful by far, that living and fossil species have evolved from a common ancestor. The anatomy, biochemistry, and embryonic development of each species contains innumerable characters like the pentadactyl limb and the genetic code, characters that are similar between species but would not be if the species had independent origins. This is a very powerful and, as Ridley says, widespread argument. It's in his chapter on the evidences for evolution. All of this is underwritten by the centuries-old principles of sufficient reason and principle of plenitude. But whereas theologians of the past believed that God would create the fullest world, that's the principle of plenitude, now evolutionists are saying, yes, God would create the fullest world, as has always been believed, but that's not what we're finding. There's no sufficient reason, therefore it must have evolved. Here is the same argument from that David Baum 2016 paper. Let's have a look. It is worth noting that the methods discussed in this article do not exhaust possible sources of evidence for evolution. For example, we mentioned in the introduction that in principle a single character that could exist in very many alternative states can provide evidence of common ancestry when the states seen in a clade or life as a whole occupy a smaller subset of state space than would be expected under separate ancestry. Analysis along these lines have been conducted for the genetic code, but there is scope for exploring additional facts. This is exactly the principles of sufficient reason and plenitude. You could not write a more accurate description in today's literature of the principles of sufficient reason and plenitude, right there in David Baum 2016. So what have we seen so far? We saw there were problems with the argument when he first started to look at it, and there was apparently a false premise to begin with. But none of that matters because what? It's a religious argument. But it gets worse. Remember the first claim? There is no reason, no sufficient reason for this code because it's arbitrary. That's not true. Here is a 2023 paper that shows that the genetic code is 1 in 10 to the 20th. That is a 1 with 20 zeros after it. Now that was an upgrade from an earlier paper that said the code was 1 in a million. In other words, the genetic code is a very special code. It is not an accident. It is not an arbitrary code. It is a rare code, a very rare code. And we're still learning more, as this paper points out. We wonder what other remarkable properties it may bear. We're not done with this yet, but it gets worse. Remember the second religious argument? There is no reason the code should be conserved. There is no reason why the code should be universal. Clearly, this is not true. Genetic material is commonly transferred between species, and this is a crucial aspect of biology. For example, horizontal gene transfer. Genes are commonly transferred between different species. The idea there is no reason the code should be conserved between species is biologically absurd. Of course, the code must be conserved between species. So to summarize, we saw that there were some problems with the argument, but that none of that mattered because it's a religious argument. Now we're seeing that the religion is contradicted by the science. Now let's look at the key points that we've seen here just to make sure this is crystal clear. Religion is crucial to the argument and evidence. This is not a sidebar. The argument is usually not spelled out, as we saw with the Kipping video. Universalness has no reason is biologically absurd. That is the claim, that there's no reason why the universal genetic code should be universal, is biologically absurd. So the religion drives the science to absurdity. More generally, evolution is scientifically absurd because this same problem crops up over and over again. This is not atheism, not secular humanism, not materialism. This is religion. And this is an extremely important, powerful argument. Now you might say, wait a minute, if this is absurd, how can it be powerful? Yes, it is both. Once you ignore the absurdity, you can make this into a very powerful argument, and very widespread, as Ridley pointed out. Finally, no one understands this. You won't learn this in your biology class. You won't learn this in your history of science or philosophy of science class. You can get a PhD and do graduate work in the life sciences or the history and philosophy of science. You won't learn this. This is not in the curricula. This is all a religious deception. Religion drives science, and it matters.